The morning light barely filtered through the grimy windows of the office building as Jason dragged his worn-out mop across the sticky floor. The sound of his movements echoed in the empty halls, a rhythmic reminder of the life he had lived for the past 20 years. His back ached with every push, his hands calloused from the constant scrubbing. But Jason didn't mind. This was his world now. The silent worker. The invisible man who cleaned up after everyone else. He wasn't seen and he wasn't heard. But that didn't bother him, not anymore. Or at least he tried to convince himself it didn't. He had been cleaning the floors of this office building for so long that the smell of the chemicals in the air had become as familiar as the sound of his own heartbeat. Every day it was the same, a cycle of scrubbing, cleaning, and going unnoticed. The executives, the people who truly ran the show, walked past him without a second glance, as if he were a ghost. He was invisible, nothing more than a cog in the machine. But deep down, beneath the layers of dust and frustration, Jason harbored a dream. It wasn't a grand dream. He didn't want to own the world, but he wanted to be more than this. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to make something of himself. For 20 years, he had silently promised himself that one day he would have a chance. One day, the world would see him for who he really was. A man with potential. A man with dreams. A man with the power to change his own fate. That day, he thought, was never going to come. The ache in his back intensified as he finished his rounds. In the cold, sterile hallways. He dropped the mop and sighed, his breath visible in the frigid air. He glanced down at the floor, stained from years of neglect and abuse, and a bitter thought crept into his mind. Was this it? Was this the best life had to offer him? Scrubbing floors in silence until he was too old to even hold a mop? Suddenly, the door to the CEO's office opened with a loud creak, and Jason froze. A tall, sharply dressed man stood in the doorway holding a stack of papers. His eyes were focused on his phone, never once glancing up. He walked right past Jason, without so much as a nod, as if he didn't exist. But then something caught Jason's eye. The man dropped one of his glasses. It shattered on the floor with a loud crack, sending tiny glass fragments skittering in all directions. The CEO didn't notice. He was too busy looking at his phone. Jason stood there, frozen. His heart was pounding in his chest, a mix of frustration and something else. Something deeper. He looked at the shattered glasses on the floor, and for a moment, something stirred inside him. Without thinking, he knelt down and began picking up the broken pieces. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was the only thing he could do in that moment. The CEO was too busy to care. But maybe, just maybe, Jason could show him something different. As he gathered the broken shards, he glanced up at the CEO one last time. The man was still oblivious, lost in his own world. Jason felt a strange sense of determination rise up in him. It wasn't just about fixing a pair of glasses, it was about fixing his own life. He had always been invisible, always been the one cleaning up after others. But no more. Not today. Today, something was going to change. He didn't know how or when, but he could feel it in his bones. Jason's world had always been one of simplicity and solitude. For 20 years, he had quietly accepted his role as a janitor in a high-rise building, a job that demanded nothing but his time, his strength, and his ability to go unnoticed. The fluorescent lights flickered above him as he pushed, his mop across the floor, each stroke of the mop a silent reminder of the life he had come to accept. He wasn't just cleaning floors. He was erasing the traces of people's lives. Glasses knocked over, papers strewn about, crumbs from half-eaten lunches. It was as though he were invisible to them. They moved through the building with such urgency, with such self-importance, that they never stopped to notice him. The sound of their footsteps never slowed when they passed him. Their conversations, filled with excitement over promotions or new business deals, barely registered in his mind. He knew the routine, the pattern, the feeling of insignificance. It had become a part of him, so deeply ingrained that he no longer thought to question it. But there was more to Jason than just this routine, something that no one could see. Beneath the worn-out uniform and the tired eyes, there was a man who had never asked for more than he was given, who had never thought to fight back against the hand life had dealt him. He was humble in his acceptance, simple in his desires. All he wanted was to be respected, to be seen, to be treated as a person, not a shadow in the background. He thought back to his childhood, a time before the weight of life's disappointments had settled in. Growing up in a small, run-down neighborhood, Jason had always been the quiet one, the boy who never raised his hand in class and never stood out in the crowd. His mother had worked hard to provide for him, but the struggles of their daily life weighed heavily on both of them. Jason had always been taught to stay humble, to never ask for too much, to appreciate what he had. His innocence had been a shield, protecting him from the harsh realities of the world around him. But as the years went by, that shield had worn. Thin, and the childlike optimism he once carried had been replaced with a resigned acceptance. He had grown accustomed to being overlooked, to being ignored. The world had become a place where the quiet ones stayed quiet, and the bold ones took what they wanted. And Jason? He had never been bold. He had never fought for a seat at the table. As he knelt to pick up the CEO's broken glasses, a wave of vulnerability washed over him. He wasn't just cleaning up the glass. He was piecing together the fragments of his own broken dreams. The act was small, almost insignificant, but to him, it was more than that. It was a moment where his innocence shone through. He wasn't trying to make a statement or get recognition. He was simply doing what he had always done, quietly, humbly, without expectation. In that moment, as his hands carefully gathered the shards of glass, Jason wasn't just the janitor in the building. He was a man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long, a man who had never once asked for anything more than a chance. The sympathy that people felt for him was not born out of pity, but out of a recognition of the simple truth. Jason was just like everyone else. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to change the world. He was just trying to survive. The innocence in his actions, the quiet, unassuming way he picked up the pieces, was a reflection of the man he had always been, a man who believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. It wasn't about the glasses. It wasn't about the CEO. It was about a man who had spent his life quietly believing that if he did what was right, even in the smallest ways, he would eventually find his place in the world. But the world, for Jason, had always been indifferent. It had never given him the recognition he deserved. And yet, in this small, seemingly insignificant act, something shifted. It was the first crack in the armor of his own self-doubt, a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness, even the humblest gestures, could change the course of a life. Jason wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking for a grand transformation, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something inside him, something he had lost years ago. Belief. Belief that things could be different. Belief that he could be different. The CEO, oblivious to the man kneeling at his feet, would never understand the gravity of this moment for Jason. But in that quiet, still corner of the office, Jason knew something had shifted inside him, and it was only a matter of time before the world would take notice. As Jason sat quietly in the office, the tiny pieces of broken glass scattered around him, a profound realization slowly started to settle in. The shattered glasses in his hands were no longer just a symbol of the CEO's clumsiness. They had come to represent something much more significant. For the first time in years, Jason allowed himself to truly reflect on the life he had led. His entire existence had been about duty and obligation, about cleaning up the messes others made without ever once questioning why he had to remain in the shadows. His days were filled with menial tasks, his nights spent in solitude, while others, with far fewer responsibilities, enjoyed the luxuries of wealth and success. He had resigned himself to this life, convincing himself that it was all he deserved. This was his place in the world. This was his fate. But as he knelt there, staring at the broken shards in his hand, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a grand revelation, but a subtle stirring in his heart, an awareness that for so long he had been blind to his own worth. The truth hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. He wasn't just the janitor. He wasn't just the invisible, unnoticed figure in the background. He had been selling himself short all these years. And for what? The years he had spent mopping floors, the long, exhausting hours, the lack of recognition. Had it been worth it? At that moment, he realized how deeply he had buried his own dreams and desires, all in the name of modesty and humility. But humility couldn't erase the quiet desperation that had slowly seeped into his soul. It couldn't heal the wounds of seeing others climb to great heights while he remained stuck in the same position, cleaning up after them. He had convinced himself that being invisible was okay. That contentment came from accepting the cards life had dealt him. But in doing so, he had never asked himself what he wanted. The moral awakening was simple, yet profound. Jason realized that he had the power to change his own story. His life didn't have to be defined by his past choices, his past circumstances, or the limitations others placed on him. He wasn't destined to be a servant, a background figure forever. He had worth beyond the floor he mopped, beyond the menial tasks that he did so quietly, so unassumingly. His work may have been valuable in its own right, but it didn't define who he was. The true measure of his worth was in his dreams, his desires, his untapped potential. Jason had lived his life according to the belief that being humble meant remaining small, that not asking for more was the noble path. He had allowed himself to believe that it was selfish to aspire for greatness. But that was where he had gone wrong. His awakening didn't just stem from the realization that he was capable of more. It came from the understanding that he deserved more. That ambition, in its purest form, wasn't about selfishness. It was about growth, evolution, and contributing something greater to the world. He had sacrificed so much for others, for the company, for the executives who never noticed him, who walked past him as if he were invisible. But what had he sacrificed for himself? In his desire to please, to serve, to remain out of the spotlight, he had denied himself the right to dream, to aim higher. His own aspirations had been buried beneath a cloak of modesty and selflessness. But now, he understood that selflessness didn't mean sacrificing your own potential. It meant using your talents and abilities to contribute to the world in the best way you could, in a way that also brought fulfillment to your own life. As Jason reflected on his life, his heart swelled with a mixture of regret and hope. He regretted not taking the opportunities he had once dreamed of. He regretted not believing in himself sooner, not fighting for what he truly wanted. But beneath that regret was something else, a newfound determination. This was his chance. His moral awakening didn't just mark the end of his past way of thinking, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could take control of his destiny. The moment the CEO entered the room, Jason knew he had to speak up. He had to step into his power and demand respect, not just from others, but from himself. No longer would he be the man in the BANT background, the janitor who cleaned up after others. He had a voice. He had ideas. He had value, and he was finally ready to claim it. The moral awakening was not just about realizing his potential, it was about realizing his right to live life on his own terms. He had spent too many years believing that success and wealth were reserved for others, that they were for the bold and the ambitious. But Jason understood now that success wasn't just about the money or the status. It was about recognizing your own worth, believing in your abilities, and taking the leap to pursue something greater than the limitations you had set for yourself. In that moment, Jason decided to take action. He would no longer let the world define him by his job, by his past, or by the roles others had imposed on him. He would take control of his future. He would rise. And in doing so, he would not only change his life, but also the lives of those around him. The moral awakening was the first step in his transformation, one that would take him far beyond the janitor's closet and into a future filled with endless possibilities. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in the lavish CEO office, the glass in his hands reflecting the stark contrast between the life he had lived and the life that was now unfolding before him. The heavy silence hung in the air as the CEO, Richard Donovan, paced across the room, his mind obviously preoccupied. The weight of the moment felt suffocating, yet Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something bigger than he could ever imagine. It wasn't just about repairing the glasses anymore. It was about the fleeting moment of connection between two vastly different worlds, his and Richard's. As Jason bent over to fix the shattered glasses, he could feel his palms sweat, his breath shallow. The fragility of the moment hit him in a way he couldn't explain. The CEO, a man with power, wealth, and influence, was standing before him, completely unaware of the emotional storm raging inside Jason. For years, Jason had quietly watched as the people around him soared to great heights while he remained invisible. His life had been one of quiet humility, of accepting whatever scraps were thrown his way. He had long since come to terms with the idea that his place in the world was to serve, to remain in the background, mopping floors and handling tasks that others deemed beneath them. He had accepted the reality that his dreams were out of reach, that ambition was reserved for the fortunate few, and he was not one of them. But as he fixed the broken glasses in his hands, something inside him began to stir. The pain of his own missed opportunities, the regret of never having fought for himself, bubbled to the surface. It wasn't just about the physical act of repairing the glasses. It was about the symbol they represented. He was fixing something that had been broken, just like he had been. His life had been broken into pieces, and for the first time, he realized that he had the ability to put those pieces back together. Jason's thoughts raced as he stood there, the glass in his hands trembling slightly. He could feel his entire being shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything he had been through. He had spent 20 years cleaning up other people's messes, quietly accepting his role without ever questioning it. But now, as the CEO stood in front of him, oblivious to the emotional battle raging inside Jason, he felt something shift. He felt a surge of anger, a quiet but powerful anger that came from years of being overlooked, from years of feeling insignificant, from years of hiding his own desires in the shadows. But beneath the anger, there was something else, something far deeper. It was the slow, dawning realization that he wasn't just a janitor, a faceless figure in the background. He was a man with value, with dreams, with the potential to do something far greater than he had ever allowed himself to believe. And in that moment, as the CEO looked down at the glasses in Jason's hands, Jason knew that this was his moment. The time to change everything had come. Richard's voice broke the silence, his tone laced with frustration. "Are you done with those glasses yet?" The simple question was the spark that set off a chain of events Jason had never seen coming. Jason took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He glanced up at Richard, the man who had been the face of everything Jason had quietly longed for. Richard stood there, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But in that moment, Jason saw through the facade. He saw a man who, despite his wealth and power, was just as human as he was. With a steady hand, Jason placed the repaired glasses carefully on the desk. He didn't rush this moment. It was the most important moment of his life, and he wasn't about to let it slip away unnoticed. He took a step back, his heart racing, his thoughts clear for the first time in years. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Richard's eyes met his, and for a brief second, there was a flicker of recognition. But then, as quickly as it came, it disappeared, replaced by the cold detachment that Jason had come to expect from the CEO. Still, Jason felt something stir in him, a quiet, undeniable truth that was now impossible to ignore. "I fixed your glasses," Jason said, his voice steady but his heart beating fast. "But I'm not just your janitor anymore." The words hung in the air, charged with an energy that neither of them had expected. It was as if, in that single sentence, Jason had shattered the walls he had built around himself. For the first time, he had spoken his truth, loudly, clearly, and without hesitation. And as the words echoed in the room, something incredible happened. Jason could see the shift in Richard's eyes. A flicker of surprise, then confusion, followed by a moment of introspection. The man who had always been in control, the man who had always looked down on Jason from his pedestal, now seemed unsure. It was as if, for the briefest moment, Jason's declaration had cracked the veneer of power Richard had carefully constructed over the years. But it wasn't just Richard's reaction that stunned Jason. It was the way he felt in that moment. For the first time in his life, Jason felt powerful. He felt visible. He felt like he mattered. The silence between them stretched on, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like the calm before a storm. Jason's heart continued to race, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from the anticipation of something new, something that would define the rest of his life. As Richard stared at him, Jason knew that this moment wasn't just about the glasses or the job he had done for 20 years. It was about everything that had led him here. The pain, the struggle, the quiet sacrifices, and everything that would come after. For 2 decades, Jason had been the invisible man behind the scenes, quietly cleaning, mopping, and doing the work no one else was willing to. Day in and day out, he had performed his duties without a word of thanks or recognition. His existence, often overlooked, his efforts taken for granted. The truth was, Jason never expected to be celebrated. His role was to serve, to quietly do his job, and disappear into the background. It was all he knew, and over the years he had come to accept it as his place in life. But the sacrifice was heavier than anyone could have imagined. He hadn't just been cleaning floors for a paycheck. No, it was far more than that. Behind the seemingly mundane tasks, Jason was giving up his own dreams, his own ambitions, to simply make ends meet. He had put his life on hold day after day, all to ensure that others could thrive. When the world passed by him, he quietly watched, with no resentment. only the belief that his place in life was to support the dreams of others, no matter the cost to his own. He sacrificed his health, working long hours that drained him physically and mentally. He sacrificed his time, choosing to spend his evenings cleaning office buildings and corporate spaces instead of being with his family or working on his own future. He sacrificed his dignity, enduring the snide remarks and dismissive attitudes of those who looked down on him because of his job. The unspoken truth was that Jason had given up so much, yet never complained. He kept his head down, did his work, and hoped that maybe, just maybe, his silent sacrifices would matter someday. It wasn't just about what Jason had given up for work. It was about the parts of his soul he had quietly tucked away, believing that they would never see the light of day. He had dreams, ambitions, and ideas that could have taken him far, but he had buried them deep inside, thinking they were too far out of reach. With every floor he mopped, every corner he cleaned, he was slowly erasing his own identity, sacrificing pieces of himself that he had never gotten the chance to reclaim. His life had become a series of silent sacrifices, and in the process, he lost sight of the person he had once been, the person who had believed in his own worth. But it wasn't just the personal sacrifices. Jason had given up his relationships, too. As he poured every ounce of his energy into his work, he found himself increasingly isolated from his loved ones. Time with his family became a luxury he could no longer afford, and friendships slipped away as he became consumed by the endless grind of his job. The emotional toll was heavy, and yet, Jason never once allowed himself to feel sorry for his sacrifices. He simply kept going, because that was what was expected of him. His friends saw him as the reliable one, the one who would always show up, no matter the circumstance. His family saw him as the rock they could always lean on, the steady hand that would support them through thick and thin. Jason's sacrifice was the quiet foundation upon which the world around him had been built, and yet, no one saw the cost. It wasn't until he stood there, holding the shattered glasses in his hands, that the weight of his sacrifices truly hit him. As he gazed at the broken lenses, the years of quiet, unnoticed labor seemed to flood back in waves. The nights he had spent working overtime while his friends went out, the holidays he had missed to ensure the offices were spotless, the endless hours spent doing the jobs no one else wanted. Suddenly they all came rushing back. And with them, a quiet question. Was it worth it? Jason didn't have an answer right away. He couldn't answer that question for himself just yet. But what he did know was that standing here, in this moment, something had changed. The man he had been, the silent worker, the one who had sacrificed everything for others, was slowly starting to fade away. The person who was emerging now was someone different, someone who had realized the true cost of his sacrifices, and someone who was beginning to understand that he deserved more than just to be a cog in someone else's machine. As Richard Donovan, the CEO, stood before him, Jason's thoughts raced. He had spent years cleaning Richard's office, mopping the floors, and fixing what others had broken. But now, as the CEO's cold eyes met his, Jason realized that he had never truly been seen. Not as the man he was, not as the person with a soul and dreams. For the first time, Jason began to question whether all his sacrifices had been in vain. The silence between them was deafening. Jason stood there, waiting for Richard to acknowledge the work he had done. No, more than that. To acknowledge the man he had been all these years. But instead, he was met with cold indifference. The reality hit him hard. His silent sacrifices had never been noticed. His hard work had never been truly appreciated. It was a painful realization, one that Jason had spent years avoiding. But In that moment, something shifted inside him. The weight of his sacrifices, those silent, unseen acts of service, had been the very things that had led him here. They had shaped him, molded him, and made him strong in ways he never even realized. And now, as he stood there, holding the repaired glasses in his hands, he realized that his time of silent sacrifice was over. Jason wasn't just going to fix broken glasses anymore. He was going to fix his own broken life. And this was just the beginning. Jason stood firm, his hands clenched tightly around the broken glasses, his eyes focused and unwavering. Every muscle in his body was tense, his mind racing, yet everything inside him seemed to calm as he faced the man who had been the symbol of everything he had once wished to escape. This was not just about fixing a pair of broken glasses anymore. This was about something far deeper, about standing up for himself, about defending what was rightfully his, and about protecting the man he had become after all those silent years of sacrifice. The years of being invisible, of silently enduring. Every insult, every slight, every time his worth was overlooked, had all led him to this exact moment. He had spent too long letting the world walk over him, letting people take advantage of his kindness, and worse, taking him for granted. But now, he wasn't the same person anymore. The boy who had mopped floors for 20 years, quietly submitting to the whims of others, had been replaced by someone stronger, someone unyielding. The weight of his silent sacrifices had forged him into a man with a steel-like resolve, a man who now understood his own worth. Jason's eyes narrowed as he looked at Richard Donovan, the CEO, standing tall in front of him, his expression as cold and detached as ever. Richard was everything Jason had once aspired to be, powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. But now, standing there, holding the glasses, Jason saw the CEO in an entirely different light. He had once looked up to Richard, admired him, and believed that if he worked hard enough, he could become like him. But now, all he saw was a man who had never bothered to look beyond his own success, a man who had built his empire on the sweat and sacrifices of people like Jason. As Richard reached out to take the repaired glasses from Jason, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let Richard continue to treat him like a mere cog in his machine anymore. He wasn't going to let the sacrifices he had made for 20 years go unnoticed. No, this time, Jason would stand his ground, and he would make sure that his voice was heard. With a deep breath, Jason's posture shifted. No longer hunched in the way he had been for years, carrying the weight of invisible labor and unspoken pain, he straightened. The tension in his shoulders melted into a quiet but powerful determination. His gaze locked with Richard's, steady and unwavering, a silent challenge in his eyes. There was no more fear, no more hesitation, just a quiet resolve that told Richard everything he needed to know. Jason wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Richard looked taken aback for a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. For the first time, Jason saw the CEO as he truly was, a man who had spent so much time at the top that he had forgotten what it was like to be human. He had forgotten what it meant to struggle, to sacrifice, to be invisible. But now, Jason was determined to remind him. He had been invisible for far too long, and he would not let this opportunity slip through his fingers. "Mr. Donovan," Jason spoke, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the CEO pause. "For years I've worked here, cleaning your floors, repairing your things, doing the tasks you didn't want to do. I've given up my time, my health, my dignity, but I'm not just a janitor anymore. I'm a man who's learned the value of his own worth." His words hung in the air between them, sharp and resolute. Jason wasn't speaking out of anger. He wasn't driven by a desire for revenge or bitterness. He was speaking out of the deep protective love he now had for himself. A love that had been born out of years of silence, of sacrifice, and of slowly realizing that he deserved more than what life had given him. Jason's heart raced, not with fear, but with the thrill of standing up for himself. This was no longer about the glasses. This was about protecting the person he had become, the man who had worked tirelessly and quietly for years, and who now demanded respect. This was about taking back his life, about deciding that his future was his to shape, not someone else's to control. The protective nature of his determination was like a shield around his heart. He would no longer let people walk all over him. He would no longer hide in the shadows, shrinking from confrontation or avoiding the truth of his worth. Jason had fought too long in silence to let anyone silence him now. "I've learned a lot from my time here, Mr. Donovan," Jason continued, his voice growing stronger. "But the most important lesson is this. I'm not just here to serve. I'm here to stand up for myself. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time for me to move on and show you that I am capable of much more than mopping floors." The weight of his words hit Richard, who stood there in stunned silence, unable to respond. Jason's protective mood, the fierce determination to protect his self-worth and his newfound resolve, was clear. He was no longer the man who had silently endured the hardships. He was the man who had faced those hardships head-on and emerged stronger, unbreakable, and ready to claim the future that he deserved. Jason's eyes never left Richard's, and in that moment he knew that his life was no longer defined by his past. His future was his own to decide, and no one, not even the CEO, could take that away from him. The protective aura around him was not just a defense of his past. It was a declaration of the future he was about to build. Richard Donovan sat in his plush office chair, staring at the glasses Jason had just repaired. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned them over in his hand, the cold, sleek frames reflecting the harsh office lights. It was only a pair of broken glasses. It seemed like a trivial thing in the grand scheme of his life, his empire, his wealth, his power. Yet, as he looked at them, his mind couldn't stop racing, each thought haunting him like a ghost from his past. For years, he had treated Jason like an invisible cog in his machine, a worker to be discarded when no longer needed. Jason had been nothing but loyal, quiet, humble, never asking for anything in return. He had mopped floors, fixed things, and stayed in the background, doing what was required without a word of complaint. And Richard had ignored him, overlooked him, as he had with countless others who had served him over the years. But now, something about Jason's actions had left a lasting impact. There was something about the way Jason had looked at him when handing him the repaired glasses. It wasn't just the steely resolve in his eyes, it was the undeniable truth in his gaze. The truth that Richard had been blind to for so long. For so many years, Richard had lived in a bubble of success, surrounded by yes men and sycophants, insulated from the reality of the people who had made his empire possible. He had been driven by ambition, by the relentless pursuit of power and wealth, all while overlooking the sacrifices of those who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He had convinced himself that it was all part of the game, that the people he employed were just there to serve him, to help him climb higher. But Jason's words, his unwavering determination, his quiet strength, had shattered that illusion. Richard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished surface of his desk. He closed his eyes for a moment, memories flooding his mind. He remembered the first time he had hired Jason, a young man with little experience but an undeniable work ethic. Richard had seen him as nothing more than an expendable laborer, a tool to get things done without asking questions. He had never taken the time to understand him, never bothered to see the person behind the uniform. And now, as he sat alone in his office, Richard felt a deep sense of regret, a regret that gnawed at his conscience. Jason had given everything to him, his time, his energy, his silent loyalty. And Richard had taken it all for granted. He had never once stopped to think about how Jason felt, about the sacrifices he had made or the life he had dreamed of. Instead, Richard had used him as a stepping stone, never once considering that the very man he had ignored might one day rise up and take control of his own destiny. But now, in the quiet of his office, Richard was faced with the truth. Jason wasn't the man he had once been. He had found his voice, his strength, and with it, he had begun to carve out a future for himself, one that no longer revolved around serving Richard or anyone else. Richard's stomach twisted as he realized the depth of his failure. He had been too consumed with his own ambitions, too blind to see the value in the people around him, and now the very person he had once overlooked had become someone he could no longer ignore. In that moment, Richard knew he had to change. He couldn't continue living in a world where he only cared about his own success, where he saw people as tools for his own advancement. He couldn't continue to treat those who had worked for him like disposable assets. He had to make things right, not just for Jason, but for himself. The regret in his heart was suffocating, but it was also the catalyst he needed for redemption. Richard stood up and paced the room, the weight of his decisions heavy on his shoulders. He had always prided himself on being a visionary, a leader who could see the bigger picture. But now he realized that true leadership wasn't just about creating wealth or power. It was about understanding the people who helped you build that empire. It was about recognizing the value in every individual, no matter their role. No matter how small it seemed, Richard knew that redemption wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't come in the form of a grand gesture or a simple apology. It would require real, tangible change. He had to make amends, not just for Jason, but for all the people he had failed to see, the ones who had helped him rise, the ones whose hard work had made his success possible. As the days passed, Richard began to take the first steps toward redemption. He called Jason into his office, his heart heavy with guilt, but also filled with determination. When Jason entered, Richard didn't see a mere employee anymore. He saw a man who had fought for his place in the world, a man who had been wronged, but had found a way to rise above it. And in that moment, Richard understood that Jason's worth had never been tied to the tasks he performed, but to the strength of his character. "Jason," Richard began, his voice steady but sincere, "I owe you an apology. For years I took you for granted. I saw you as nothing more than a worker, a tool to get things done. I failed to see your worth, and for that, I'm sorry. But I want you to know something. This company, this empire, wouldn't be here without you. And I'm ready to make things right." Jason's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and skepticism on his face. Richard continued, his words pouring out with a newfound sincerity. "I've been blind to the people who helped me get here. And I realize now that true leadership is about more than just making money. It's about respecting those who make it all possible. I want to offer you a chance, Jason. A real chance. You've worked harder than anyone I know, and you deserve more than just a paycheck. You deserve respect, opportunity, and the chance to make something of yourself. I want to offer you a position here, one where you have a voice, where you can help shape the future of this company." The words hung in the air, a promise of redemption, a glimmer of hope after years of silence. Jason stood there, processing the weight of Richard's words. For a moment, everything felt still. Richard's regret had transformed into something more powerful, the chance to change, to rebuild, and to offer a path toward a future where people like Jason weren't invisible, where their sacrifices were acknowledged. Jason's face softened, the hard edge of distrust melting away. In his eyes, Richard could see the flicker of possibility. And in that moment, both men knew that redemption wasn't just about undoing past mistakes. It was about creating something better, something more meaningful for the future. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Jason had left Richard's office hours ago, the unexpected offer weighing heavily on his mind. He'd always been the quiet type, keeping his emotions hidden behind a veil of calm. But tonight, he couldn't shake the questions that gnawed at him. Could he really trust Richard? Could someone so blind to his value all these years suddenly change? Jason walked the streets late that evening, his thoughts spiraling. The streets were quiet, bathed in the glow of street lamps. The cold air felt sharp against his skin, but it mirrored the sharpness in his thoughts. He couldn't just forget how Richard had treated him. He couldn't let go of the years of silent sacrifice, the countless nights he had spent in that office, doing the work no one else wanted to do, all while Richard remained oblivious to his existence. But there was something different now. Jason's heart thumped in his chest as his thoughts replayed Richard's words. "I want to offer you a chance, Jason, a real chance. You deserve respect, opportunity, and the chance to make something of yourself." The doubt lingered like a dark cloud overhead. Jason knew he had to make a choice, whether to walk away, leaving behind a toxic past, or to take a leap of faith and seize the opportunity Richard had presented. The decision was monumental. If he accepted the offer, he would be diving headfirst into an uncertain future. If he rejected it, he would walk away from the very chance he had dreamed of for so long. As Jason stood on the corner of the street, staring at the glowing sign of the company's headquarters in the distance, a single thought flashed through his mind. This could be your moment. This could be the break you've been waiting for. But are you brave enough to take it? His legs felt heavy, as though his very bones were warning him against it. What if Richard was just playing him? What if this was some twisted game of manipulation? Could he trust him, after everything? Jason took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, sharpening his focus. His heart was racing now, not from fear, but from something else, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he had been preparing for all along. He remembered the days when he first walked into that office, wide-eyed, eager to prove himself, wanting nothing more than to be seen as something more than just an invisible worker. Over the years, his ambitions had slowly faded as the reality of the job set in. He had learned to accept the shadow, to embrace the role of the quiet man who worked in the background, unnoticed. But he had always known deep down that there was more to him than that. It wasn't just about fixing broken things, it was about fixing his own broken life. And the opportunity Richard was offering wasn't just a job, it was a chance for redemption, a chance to rewrite his own story, a chance to prove to himself and to the world that he was more than just the janitor, more than just the person people overlooked. The suspense was killing him. Jason felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, with nothing but a vast unknown below him. But then, something within him shifted. He thought of the people who had doubted him, the ones who had looked down on him all these years. He thought of the long nights he had spent working while everyone else went home to their families, the missed opportunities, the sacrifices. And he knew, in that moment, that he was ready. He wasn't just going to be another person who was overlooked and forgotten. He was going to rise above it all, even if it meant taking a risk, even if it meant diving into the unknown. The road to success, to change, had never been easy, but he wasn't afraid anymore. Jason turned and walked back toward the company headquarters, his steps purposeful now. His heart still pounded in his chest, but it was no longer a sound of fear. It was the rhythm of resolve. As he entered the building, he felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt empowering. With every step he took toward Richard's office, he was leaving behind the version of himself who had been uncertain, afraid, and silenced. He was walking toward the future, a future where he wasn't just an employee, but a leader in his own right. When he reached the office door, he paused for a moment. His fingers brushed the handle, and for a brief second, he hesitated. This was the moment of truth. But as he turned the knob and entered, something shifted in him. The doubts, the insecurities, the fears, they were all gone. This was his chance, and he was going to take it. Richard was at his desk, his back to the door. He didn't even turn when Jason walked in, but Jason wasn't intimidated. He had come too far to be intimidated now. "Mr. Donovan." Jason's voice was steady. No trace of the quiet, invisible man he used to be. Richard spun around in his chair, surprised to see Jason standing there, his eyes no longer filled with the hesitation they had once held. The same man who had once been overlooked, invisible, was now standing in front of him with a newfound confidence. Jason didn't wait for Richard to speak. "I'm ready," he said simply. "I'm ready to take the opportunity you've offered me. But know this, I'm not here to be just another worker. I'm here to build something with you, something bigger, and I'll give it everything I have." Richard's expression softened, his eyes flickering with a mix of surprise and something else: respect. He had seen many people rise to the occasion, but there was something different about Jason. Something that spoke of true strength, a strength born from years of silence, sacrifice, and unseen effort. Jason wasn't just taking a chance on Richard. He was taking a chance on himself. As Richard nodded, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Welcome aboard, Jason. Let's make something great together." The years passed in the blink of an eye. Jason stood at the top floor of the skyscraper, gazing out of the large glass windows that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The city below looked so small, the lights twinkling like stars in the vast darkness of the night. From up here, everything seemed so clear. The struggles, the doubts, the silent sacrifices. All of it felt distant now, like a dream he had long since woken from. It was hard to believe that just a few short years ago he had been mopping floors, unnoticed and unheard, in the very same building. Now, here he was, standing at the helm of the company he had once only dreamed of being a part of. He was no longer the invisible man behind the scenes. He had become a leader, someone whose voice carried weight, whose decisions shaped the future. Jason had worked tirelessly, climbing the ladder not just because he was ambitious, but because he believed in something much deeper, a belief in his own worth, a belief that the world didn't get to define who he was. He had seen the lowest points of life, the ones that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. But with every setback, with every ounce of self-doubt, he had found the strength to rise again. His journey wasn't just about success. It was about transformation. It was about proving to himself that no matter how many times life tried to knock him down, he could always rise. And the more he rose, the more he realized that this wasn't just his journey. It was for everyone who had ever felt invisible, for everyone who had ever been dismissed because of their past, their background, or their status. Jason had become a beacon of hope for those who had been in his shoes. He made it his mission to build a company where every voice was heard, where everyone had a chance to prove their worth. No one would ever have to mop floors and feel forgotten again. Not if he could help it. He knew what it felt like to be overlooked, and he would make sure no one else had to endure that same feeling on his watch. But more than that, Jason realized something profound. It wasn't the money, the prestige, or the title that mattered. Most to him, it was the opportunity to give others what he had once longed for: respect, recognition, and the chance to change their lives. Jason's success wasn't defined by his wealth or position. It was defined by the impact he had on others, by the lives he touched, the people he helped rise up from their own struggles. The day had come when Jason stood before a crowd of eager faces, his employees, colleagues, and partners. He had invited them there for a special announcement, but as he stepped up to the podium, his mind wandered back to the days when he was just another invisible worker in the background, his every move unnoticed, his value underestimated. He had come so far from that place, but it was those very struggles that had shaped him into who he was today. Jason smiled, the weight of the journey settling into his bones. He took a deep breath, looking out at the crowd, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a profound sense of peace. His eyes scanned the room, and he saw faces that were once just like his, faces filled with potential, hidden behind layers of doubt and fear. He could see it in their eyes, the same longing for change that had once burned in his own heart. "Today," Jason began, his voice steady but filled with conviction, "we are not just celebrating the success of this company. We are celebrating the spirit of perseverance. We are celebrating the courage to stand up when life has knocked us down, to continue fighting when the odds are stacked against us. And most importantly, we are celebrating each and every one of you, the people who make this company what it is." The room was silent, all eyes on him. Jason's heart swelled with pride, not for the accomplishments he had achieved, but for the people who had stood by him and helped him along the way. He had never been alone in this journey. The people in this room, his team, his employees, his friends, were the ones who had made this all possible. They had believed in him when he had nothing to offer but hard work and dedication, and now he was giving them the same chance to rise. "I am where I am today because I had the chance to prove myself," Jason continued, his voice growing stronger. "And I want to make sure each of you has the same opportunity. No one should ever feel invisible here. No one should ever feel like they don't have a voice. I'm committed to making this company a place where everyone can shine, no matter where they come from or what they've been through." The crowd erupted into applause, but for Jason, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the look in their eyes, the look of hope, of belief, of something shifting deep within them. They saw in him a reflection of themselves, a person who had fought his way out of the shadows, who had embraced his worth and found his purpose. As the applause faded, Jason felt a quiet sense of satisfaction wash over him. He had come full circle from being the janitor to becoming the CEO. But more than that, he had found something more valuable than any title or paycheck. He had found the power to change lives, to help others believe in their own worth. Just as he had. Jason looked out over the room one last time, a smile tugging at his lips. He had always known that the real measure of success wasn't about how high you climbed, but about how many people you lifted along the way. And in that moment, Jason knew he had done just that. The future was brighter now, not just for him, but for everyone in that room. The seeds of hope had been planted, and it was up to them to grow, to reach their full potential, just as he had. As Jason stepped down from the podium, he felt a wave of gratitude flood over him. He had made it. not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever believed in the power of second chances. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was ready for whatever came next.